For 120 years, Liberty Magazine has stood at the crossroads of history and celebration, a living chronicle of voices, victories, and visions that shape generations. Today, we honor more than a milestone. We celebrate a legacy that continues to inspire the future. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests that we have for today. First, we have Mr. Ivor Myers, speaker and director of the Power of the Lamb Ministries. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have with us Mr. Michael Campbell, the director of the North American Division Department of Archives, Statistics, and Research, and Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here and looking forward to our show. As the United States marks the 250th anniversary of its founding, Liberty Magazine currently maintains a national circulation of just under 200,000, is reaching its own historic milestone, 120 years of continuous publication. Since 1906, Liberty has served as a key public outreach tool that shares trusted information about religious freedom with lawmakers, judges, attorneys, and civic and faith leaders across North America. Liberty Magazine brings a unique perspective to current public policy debates. It also serves as a resource for church members on current issues of religious freedom and church-state relations. And true to its Adventist heritage, Liberty supports both strong protections for religious free exercise and a clear separation of church and state. Its Declaration of Principles is published in every issue and begins with the statement that the God-given right of religious liberty is best exercised when church and state are separate. You know, Bettina, being the current editor-in-chief of Liberty Magazine, and the fact that you now really shepherd in the opportunities that started 120 years ago, maybe you can kind of give us an idea of where we are today, maybe where we have been in the past, and just the importance of what this magazine means, not only to the church, but to individuals outside of the church.
Well, Orlin, Liberty Magazine, as you said, is 120 years old. It is the oldest religious liberty journal in the world today. And the issue that we are grappling with editorially at Liberty Magazine is one of the definition of religious freedom. One of our unofficial taglines is taking religious liberty back from the political extremes, because we're in a situation today in America where we have on one side of the equation those on the left who say religious liberty has reached its use-by date. It needs to be minimized. It needs to be controlled. It's merely an excuse for discrimination. But then on the other side, you have those who say religious liberty should be used as a tool, as something that can be used to, in the words of a T-shirt I saw recently, to make America Christian again. The mission of Liberty Magazine is the same today as it was back in 1906, and that is to present a balanced understanding of religious liberty that's in line with America's constitutional heritage of strong Establishment Clause restraints, as well as robust religious freedom, and also to represent a certain understanding of God. And that is an understanding that I think was really best expressed by a writer, Ellen White, who's one of the founders of the Adventist Church. I'm going to paraphrase here, but she wrote that the exercise of force is contrary to the character of God, and that only through love can love be awakened. That kernel, that truth, is really what drives the mission of Liberty Magazine today.
No, Michael, you're an expert on on research and statistics and archives. When you think about the Adventist Church having a publication that's 120 years old, I gotta imagine guys like you must smile with the biggest smile in the world and say, I've got all the information. Tell us a little bit about kind of maybe how this got started and the importance even it's been in the area of archives and statistics for our church.
Absolutely. So in terms of the magazine itself, I mean, the ethos goes back to the very beginnings of Adventism. And so part of that reformist pulse of going back to the Bible, our earliest pioneers of our church were really reformers. And so as they looked at wanting to be faithful to Scripture, there's this sort of a theology that became very clear. And I think it's very interesting. Every reform in church history has started with a clearer view or understanding of the character of God, and the fact that he doesn't force people. He invites in love, and people have free will, free choice, agency. And so this becomes a very much a grounding in the beginnings of Adventism, so that by the time the late 19th century, as people began to have debates, for example, of what day to worship, should there be religious legislation to restrict people to a certain day of the week, that those debates garnered within Adventism a strong pulse to educate people and to really advocate for religious freedom, that people should be able to choose and not be forced. And so it's the late 19th century that our earliest pioneers, they actually began a series of pamphlets, the Religious Liberty Sentinel, later the American Sentinel in 1886. 20 years later, after the church forms a religious liberty department, you will see the birth of Liberty Magazine as we know it today. And that's what we're celebrating now. And so Liberty has been the vanguard of trying to, both within the church and outside more broadly, just educate people about biblical principles of religious freedom, where this comes from, looking at current issues within society, and could go back and look at a whole host of different issues that have come up over time. But I'm very, as a historian, as an archivist, I'm excited because it's been one of our premier publications of our denomination and continuously advocating and published since 1906. And that's something, as a historian, as an archivist, I'm very proud of, love that history, that heritage that's there. And of course, that legacy in print is one of the great legacies of Adventism, I believe.
Ivor, you're kind of like the boots on the ground. You're a pastor in front of a congregation. I've heard you preach on religious liberty a number of times, and we even had you to be keynote speakers at even religious liberty events we've done across the country. When you think about the importance of religious freedom and just the opportunity of what you do as you connect with congregations on a regular basis, what has this meant to you? And is religious freedom concepts really being discussed in our churches today in a way that maybe some may be surprised, maybe is not?
I have to say that I've been Adventist for almost 30 years. And in my experience, Religious Liberty Day in church was typically a day that was just like, all right, hurry up, get your spotlight, and let's move on. That's kind of what my experience was until 2019. And the interest that began to sweep our church in terms of religious liberty. And I think some of the reasons behind it are good. I think some of the reasons behind it are unfortunately misguided. But now more than ever, I see the importance of understanding religious liberty. It's at an all-time high. And I think, this magazine and this ministry is really like, this is the time for this kind of work.
Orlin, I have to say, so you mentioned in the introduction that my primary responsibilities for the Adventist Church is working down on Capitol Hill, representing the church's religious freedom interest there. I also have the privilege of serving as the associate editor of Liberty Magazine. So I am 100% biased, but I'm also being 100% honest in saying that Liberty is such an incredible resource for the work that I do as an individual on behalf of the church. It is an entry point before I ever even go to Capitol Hill or have a meeting with a member of Congress. Liberty Magazine is already arriving and has been arriving on their desk every 2 months for decades. The Adventist Church's, again, unique understanding of what religious freedom is has already been established well before I ever go to these meetings. So it's incredibly helpful. My own state legislature representative mentioned Liberty's the only magazine that I allow in my waiting area, right? I look forward to it. So as we're talking about, we're celebrating its legacy and how long it has existed. I'm so proud as an individual church member how consistent the message has been. It's been consistent with, again, the Seventh-day Adventist Church's unique understanding, and I believe correctly representing the character of God and what it means to honor God and to honor your conscience and to honor the conscience of others, right? I have opportunity in the work that I do to partner with many other faith traditions down on Capitol Hill when we're doing advocacy work on various pieces of legislation. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church's understanding of religious freedom, particularly in this time period of the need and the value for that separation of church and state, is unique. And so I'm very grateful that this voice exists and has such a rich legacy.
Bettina, you got to tell us a little bit about when you think about this 120-year history, and you've had other jobs working in the church in many different capacities, and then you find yourself being the editor-in-chief of this magazine. But even more uniquely, in 120 years, you are the first woman editor-in-chief of this magazine. What was that transition like? 120 years of guys and then you. How did you feel about having to deal with all of that?
So, Orlin, when I first came to Liberty Magazine, I'd spent the greater part of my working life focused on international religious freedom. And when you're talking about international religious freedom, things are pretty clear cut. I mean, it simply means the right to live your faith out loud without fear of reprisals. But then something really strange starts to happen when you start talking about religious liberty within the North American context. Things start getting really complicated. And, it took me a few days on the job before I realized that, not all Adventist church members think the same way about all of these issues. I mean, these are issues that are highly emotive. They're politically charged. They are issues where there is just intense disagreement about many of these things. But, as all of us have highlighted, one of the strengths of Liberty Magazine is that it has a consistent message. When I first came on, I made the pledge I was going to read every issue of Liberty Magazine starting in April 1906. I think I got up to about 1940, something like that.
Wow.
Before I read, yeah, I know, pretty impressive. But the point is that there is this thread of continuity between then and now. I mean, you just take the language and translate it into more modern language. We're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And let me just highlight too that it's not just religious liberty for Seventh-day Adventists. It is religious liberty for all people of faith and of no faith. I mean, on the pages of Liberty Magazine, you will see clearly that we stand on principle beside atheists, beside, Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, people whose religious beliefs are very different to our own, because we believe in the principle of religious freedom. That right there is the defining feature of what makes Liberty Magazine different to other religious liberty advocacy groups and publications.
Well, Ivor, you had an epiphany in 2019, it seems. So as you've kind of gone through that transition, what have you learned about maybe religious freedom that didn't hit you the same way maybe prior to that time? And your interactions with people, your congregations that apparently have political points of view that may not always be the same. What has that been like for you, being on what I would call the ground floor, on the front lines, dealing with these topics?
When I think about what religious liberty means in other countries, right, versus what we've taken it to mean here, it's almost like, to a certain degree, we're in America here, we're bored and we need some kind of action because all the action's happening overseas. We're not getting persecuted here. Well, we need something that we feel persecuted about. And I don't say that lightly because I think to a great degree, we take for granted the freedom that we have here to such a degree that when something minor comes up, we look at it as this is about to be the end of the world. You know, if my religious liberty isn't protected, whatever that thing might be, we make it something much greater than it actually is. And so for me, the struggle has been, how do I relay to the people I'm speaking to that the things that determine, truth from error, right from wrong, is not what their favorite political, football is. It's the scriptures. And as a Christian, that means if someone does not believe in the scripture, they are also entitled to liberty.
Wow.
To believe what they want to believe. And what I've found is that liberty for me and not for thee seems to be kind of a catchphrase that a lot of people don't realize, right? And that's again one of the reasons why I think Liberty Magazine and this ministry right now is so crucial, because like I said, I think, and you all may disagree, but I know on the ground, 10, 15 years ago, in the churches I've pastored, hurry, Religious Liberty Day, you got your 5 minutes, the congregation is like, let's go. Now, yeah, religious liberty, everybody's a religious liberty expert. Let's put it that way. Everybody has become a legal expert in religious liberty. And it's a spectacle to behold.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think we're zoning in on the idea that what it looked like a few years ago is looking very different than what it looks like today, but even more scary, we're not even sure what it's going to look like tomorrow. Coming up, social media posts claim that Canada criminalized quoting the Bible in public. Stick around, we'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. Recently, social media posts claimed Canada criminalized the Bible or made it illegal to publicly quote scripture after the House of Commons passed Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act. The post went on to suggest that pastors, parents, and ordinary Christians could face legal consequences for sharing biblical teachings in public. This is a direct assault, some would say, on Christianity, turning faithful expression into a potential crime while hiding behind the mask of tolerance. The post ended. Similarly, an article shared that the English-speaking Catholic Council of Canada claimed that Bill C-9 would allow the criminalization of religious expression and belief when quoting parts of the Bible. Melissa, I'm taking a look at what we see happening, and some will say, well, this is Canada, this is not the United States, but I think we've all learned what happens in one person's backyard can show up in your backyard very easily from a global perspective. But when you hear something like this and you ask yourself the question, could I ever imagine that there would have been a piece of legislation anywhere in the world that potentially could criminalize scripture coming from the Bible?
In our last segment, we talked about sort of the North American and specifically the U.S. perspective of religious freedom is often very different than the international perspective and the challenges and concerns that we have. And I think this is an example here in Canada. It's more similar to the European perspective. Canada is much more secular society, and therefore their view of religion and its appropriate place in society is very different. The social media posts that we've seen come out, is this criminalizing? Will this criminalize the Bible? Again, sort of where this is in the legislative process. It's been passed by the House of Commons, been introduced into the Senate. So it's not currently law, it's just being considered, right? But the issue is a broader one. And I think that there is reason for people of faith to be concerned, because we have seen legislation like this passed, or ordinances put into, the criminal code. For example, Norway, the country of Norway, passed something and actually tried and convicted a former government official for language that she used, which was biblical language in material that she had published over 20 years ago. And so I think that there is reason for there to be concern. I think that the good people of Canada have good intentions with this piece of legislation, because they're trying to respond a huge uptick in anti-Semitism there in the country. And so they're looking for ways to stymie that. But much like a lot of things that we do or governments do, they don't achieve their purpose, right?
Yeah.
And when you have hate speech laws like this, the concern from my perspective is they always butt up against free speech rights, free press rights, freedom of religion rights, and they're often very vaguely worded, which is a concern that I see about this Canadian version. So what is hate speech exactly, defining what that is and what it isn't? And then I think probably most importantly, they're not effective in actually achieving the goal of reducing the anti-Semitism or whatever the achieved goal is. So the most concerning component of this proposed piece of legislation is a proposed amendment that has come through. And from my understanding, it's likely that this amendment would be included should the bill pass. And that amendment would take away the religious exemption that currently is included in current hate crime laws there in Canada. The religious exemption basically says that people cannot be convicted on charges for willful promotion of hate speech if the speech is based on good faith or based in good faith on the interpretation of religious text. To me, that's important to have in and to be included, and I find it concerning that it would be excluded from this new piece of legislation.
Yeah, so as a Canadian looking, obviously, I think there's a lot of people that are concerned and wanting to monitor the situation very carefully, what it's actually going to look like once it gets through the Senate. As Melissa indicated, this is not finished legislation. There's a number of different proposals, what this could look like. The real question is going to be, how is it actually enforced afterwards if it were to be passed? So I do know, talking to some of our Canadian church leaders up there in legal counsel, that I know that they're monitoring the situation very carefully. So we'll have to see how this kind of plays out. Proponents are arguing, that they're not trying to restrict religious liberty. Obviously, at the same time, when you start looking at that legislation, if some of the amendments were to be incorporated and passed, depending on how it was enforced, it could be, again, problematic. So it's hard to say because it's a process. And I would reiterate what Melissa just said, that, it's a much more secular environment. So people are very concerned. They don't want to have language that could be construed as anti-Semitic or against someone's sexual orientation or perceptions thereof. And that's really what we're looking at. And again, I know church leaders are monitoring it very closely.
Ivor, one of the things that's interesting is when we think about, people of faith, that sometimes our faith can make us feel elitist. This idea that maybe we're using the Bible more as a sword as opposed to a shield. And in more secular societies, they're not looking at the church and saying, well, wait a second. Church is supposed to be demure and quiet, but it looks like you guys are loud and boisterous. And now we get this pushback. This seems to be part of the issue we've got to be concerned with when we think about something like this. Why does this come up? Well, maybe church people are not being as kind and loving as they should be.
Jesus said, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. I think to a large degree, a lot of the pushback that we see in secular society, a lot of the blame lies at the feet of Christian believers who, like Peter, have said, we want to use the gospel as a sword. And the end result is people become wary of, you Christians are trying to get power. And I think a lot of the reaction that we see is people are afraid of what will happen should Christians gain political power. How would they wield the sword? I think it's a warranted concern. I think, trying to limit religious liberty is not the right way to do it. But when you're in a situation where, the Bible forewarns, hey, these things are coming to pass, people are trying to find the best footing, and doing that outside of Christ, whether you're an unbeliever or a believer, will end you up in trouble.
Wow. Bettina, when we see where these things are going, and somebody who's an editor and have seen secular societies battle through this, what are your thoughts when you hear about this piece of legislation, or your fears maybe when you hear about these pieces of legislation?
Well, what I think is that we in the United States of America need to be more appreciative of the free speech regime that we have. Because among all Western liberal democracies, we have the most absolutist protection of free speech. People don't like it sometimes. It's uncomfortable. We don't like to hear speech that makes us feel bad. But it is only by protecting speech for everyone that we preserve the fundamental liberties that we have as a country.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think what we're looking at is making sure that if you want to claim Christianity, then you have to be Christ-like at all times, in your actions with those who look like you and those who do not look like you. And hopefully, if we live our lives accordingly, we'll find ourselves in a position where one day we'll hear somebody say, well done, in the work that we've done on this earth. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin, we talked about Liberty Magazine. Did you know we've been celebrating 120 years, but during that time, there have only been 11 editors. The longest standing editor was, of course, Roland Hegstead, who served at the helm of Liberty for 34 years.
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
I have something completely random for you, Orlin. Did you know that back when the telephone was invented in 1876, they were trying to decide what was going to be the greeting that people would use on the telephone? And Alexander Graham Bell wanted everyone to say, ahoy.
No, that's a new one on me. Michael Campbell, tell me something I don't know.
I think that the way to tell a true Canadian is whether they love ketchup. And at the Calgary Stampede one year, I was taking my family there, and they had a big truck for ketchup ice cream.
Ivor, tell me something I don't know.
I allegedly have family ties to Colin Powell.
Allegedly, I love it. Hey, great being with you guys today. Really enjoyed our dialogue. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.